Oh, and welcome to this video. Where now we gonna look into another aspect of data, and that concerns roles associated with data. So up until now, we have seen data frameworks, we have seen data controls, which are implementing the frameworks. We have seen different states of data, uh, such as data at rest, data in motion, or data in use. All this data attributes also culminate into what roles we have with respect to data. So that's why this becomes very important. Also, in terms of regulation that we will see very soon, the roles needs to be well defined. Otherwise, they will create an area of doubt, and with that area of doubt, lots of liability or legality can arise. Therefore, it is important to have data roles well understood and well defined. So let's quickly look some of the data roles that are very generically available and attributable in various forms and shape to different organizations. So you can have business owners who are senior executives who are making policy about the data security. So they are as such playing the role where the data security is driven by top down. You have data or information owner, for example, the data that is generated in an application or that is traversing through an application, carrying information. That is also a role that is important uh, in order to understand where the ownership should lie. We have data custodians who are dominantly responsible, as the word custodian suggests, to act as the custodian of the data while it remains under their remit or under their access. We also have system owner, can also be application owners, which plays an important role in traversing the data through it. And then the most important part that we will also see in the next slide, and that has to do with the data controller and data processor. These particular roles have actually arisen from the need of how do we have implemented GDPR, the EU-based data protection regulation, and where it has to be clearly demarcated as to on whose request data is being collected and who is processing the data on behalf of the entity which is collecting the data. So for instance, a bank can ask you to provide your identity, such as passport or driving license, but the processing of that data, once bank stores that data, may happen in a cloud, which is outside the control or outside the premises of the bank. In that case, the data processor is the cloud provider, while the data controller is the bank on whose behalf or on whose request the data is being collected. So this demarcation and differentiation is very important in terms of regulation and in terms of application of the regulation. You also have different other roles like security administrator, supervisors, the actual users of the data, and the auditors who need to have data role to basically audit the capabilities or the information that the data carries, but also how the data is used. So these data roles are not an exhaustive list. Also, this is not the only list that is applicable in some form or shape. Different organizations use different terminologies to represent what you see here. However, important to note and important to keep in consideration is that data controller and data processor, because the term is coming out of a GDPR regulation or has been manifested out of the regulation, uh, more or less has the same meaning without the change in the underlying definition. Now, to make this picture quite clear, as you can see that the data controller for example, authorizes data processor to process data on their behalf. However, data controller is responsible for holding the data, where the data is being held, for example, where the data is making its way on request of data controller, in terms of where the data is initiated from, like the data registry system, but then actual processing of that data may happen outside of it. That is under the remit of data processor. Uh, it is important to note that this is not just a give and take relationship between data controller and data processor, but it is a well-defined uh, contractual agreement where an explicit consent needs to be obtained from data processor to data controller, or vice versa, in terms of processing the data. There may be other condition associated with this agreement in terms of where the data should reside, the geolocation of the data, who can have access to data, what is happen in terms of the in case of data processor going out of business, and other consideration. Therefore, in a nutshell, it is also important both for data controller and data processor to have a proper due care and due diligence in terms of acquiring the data and in terms of processing the data. Both holds a responsibility and accountability at different level for overall data processing. Also, as I said, data controller and processor are bounded by processing agreement. Therefore, it is important that before you initiate the actual transfer of data from a controller perspective to data processor perspective, a well-defined agreement is signed, it's uh, notified, it's registered with the regulators, so that you know that you have a fallback in case of something goes haywire, all of this agreement. So with that said, I'll stop here. Thanks for listening, and I hope to see you in the next video.